So, President Series, you'll remember the format's the word I'm looking for. Normally is to get two significant people along to speak and then start an argument. Tonight's discussion, I decided to go with just one. So Jonathan actually suggested this topic to me, and when he suggested, I said, "That's a good idea. You can talk about it," and he foolishly agreed to do so. And the point for me, and I have no idea what Jonathan's actually going to say, is that there is a lot of stuff called consultancy going around at the moment, and it is happily sold to organizations of all types, shapes and sizes, and some of it's good and some of it is less than good, and some of it is very much like the curate's egg. For those of you familiar with curate's eggs, it is both, so John's going to talk for however long it takes, and rather than having a competing talk, we're going to then debate and discuss what he has to say. And it's delightful that we have people who practice as consultants. Professor Oakland, notably, he and I sort of battle from time to time with things, and some of us have been on the receiving end, some of us on the delivery end, and some both. So we're just going to see where it all ends up. John and I have known each other for far too many years to count. He has supported and collaborated with work that I've done in thinking about and writing books, and poor chaps had to sit and drink uncountable quantities of fairly indifferent coffee while doing so. And hopefully some of the wisdom has been useful from time to time. He is I can't remember what his job title is now. He works for Rolls-Royce and he's an accountant by profession, but I think something to do with performance management and the future, roughly something. So, John Randall, introduce yourself when I give you the microphone, and you've got about sort of half an hour or however long it takes.
Great, thank you, John. I'll get the slides up and then do the intro. So let's get this on the slideshow. So are the slides coming through okay now? Brilliant. Okay, I'd just like to say thanks to John for not only the kind of coaching over the years, but also the encouragement to come and do this today. And also thank you for all of you for coming along today. So yeah, a little bit of background about me. Started my career 30 years ago, so I'm not sure that still puts me in the young category, John. Started my career as a humble physics graduate, but could not resist the lure of accountancy. So I went and spent 6 years with KPMG, and despite it being accountancy, did quite a few interesting things, but then kind of realized there was more to life than working all the hours that God sent. So I jumped across into Rolls-Royce, into a finance role, and I've been there ever since. So the last 23 years, across all the roles I've done in Rolls-Royce, I've basically been attracted to the roles that are about improvement, controls, governance systems. So more about how do we go about doing things, and hence my interest in the topic of cybernetics, and why another one of our members, Chris Field, originally put me in contact with John. In terms of what I'll focus on this afternoon, I have in mind very much the large consulting organizations. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Is some of the dysfunctionalities that I'll describe later on in the presentation, I think, are particularly prevalent in the larger organizations. But also the larger organizations, I think, have a lot of scope and opportunity to apply a theoretical models approach, because these are organizations employing tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, in some cases, of people. There's a lot of knowledge, and also there's a lot of scope there to actually gather some of those people and develop some of this stuff. But I'll explore as we go on why I think that isn't happening. So, so what I'll present today is basically, it's based on my own experience. So this isn't based on a sort of grounded research project. It's basically from my own observations of over the last 10 years or so, working with 4 of the large consulting organizations, and having kind of glancing contact with another 2 or 3. Where that's led me to, and kind of reflecting on those experiences and trying to kind of build some rationalization, understanding of why, has led me to basically 2 conclusions. One is, I think that theoretical models could improve what consulting consulting organizations do, which I think is definitely the right sort of thing to say in this forum. Otherwise, I've definitely been wasting my time coming along over the last 12 months. The other main conclusion is that I think a number of the blockers and dysfunctionalities that I see, and blockers to using conceptual models, are because I think a lot of the large consulting organizations, the dynamic with the customers, it kind of falls into the trap of selling the capacity of what we're able to implement, rather than a much more first principles position of what is really needed and how do we go about implementing that. So I think it is too capacity driven, the thinking and the choice of what to implement. Move on the slide. So in terms of what I'll just on the first section, the framework, I'll spend a couple of slides just looking at how could I see a theoretical models framework working. What might that look like? How would we navigate that? I'll then look at the problems, and there are two things I think in particular. I think one is a conflict between how success is perceived in the short to medium term to what is actually successful in the long term, that kind of dynamic of am I successfully implementing versus is my implementation actually successful? The other dynamic I'll look at there is some of the conflicts of interest, commercial conflicts of interest between supplier, large consulting organization, and customer client. The third thing I'll look at is what do we do about it? I focus very much on the client side, and that is because I think the commercial conflicts of interest mean there's more incentive for the customers to start to take a lead on this and kind of reframe things. So I think there's more incentive on the customer side to do this and move the dynamic than there is on the supplier side. Okay, so if I move on to the first section. So how can I see theoretical models working? Well, so on the vertical axis, I've got going from very sort of concrete, specific situations, particular organizations, particular processes in an organization, maybe up through various levels of abstraction, up to my kind of theory of everything level. So at the bottom, I've got everything from the kind of the corner shop selling sweets, through to a large manufacturer, through to a psychotherapist, sort of everything. And at the top, I've got my theory of everything level. Now, at the extremes, I think there's limited usefulness. To the bottom, I can only describe that particular circumstance. At the top, it's so abstract, I'd struggle to use it to solve a particular problem I've got. I think the interesting bit comes about as I try and navigate up and down those layers of abstraction. And I use that to start to understand how the situation or organization where I might be trying to solve a problem, in what ways may that be different or similar to another organization or somewhere else where an idea has come from. And I'll unpick this a bit more on the next slide, but there could be a number of different dimensions here. Could be about size of organization, could be about purpose, industry, could be about culture, could be about sort of capital intensive versus human intensive, long lead time versus short lead time. But understanding those dimensions and how my situation is similar or different to another situation may be helpful. Now, when I then start to think about this in the context of the large consulting organizations, what I see there is an attempt to do something. I think it's the things I've seen most often is focused around industry lines. So there'll be kind of groupings of people with experience of a similar industry. But what I often see is the attempt to capture knowledge is in a solution. This is the solution for the aerospace industry. This is the solution for the automotive industry. So it tends to be quite a specific solution, and quite often I think focused on industry. So if I move this down to unpack this a bit more. So the bottom of the slide, some examples are widget manufacturer. So what would success look like for a widget manufacturer? And working for a large, complex manufacturing organization like Rolls-Royce, what I'm about to say is a gross oversimplification, but it's kind of okay for the purposes of this discussion. So long as the widget conforms with spec, it's good. If I contrast that with a slightly different purpose, a banking customer or financial services customer. So certain things I can do to my widget in terms of I might have a large expensive machine, I might have automated inspection. As long as the widget comes out at the end conforming to spec, I'm good. Slightly different with the banking customer. I may have successfully put the banking customer through my process, but if the banking customer feels their perception is, I have been processed, they may object to that in a way that the widget won't. So if I then stepped on another
Sorry
step.
to interrupt you, Jonathan. Could we please remember to have our mics on mute, because I'm hearing a bit of white noise and interference. I don't know whether anybody else can hear the same.
Yeah, I'm also hearing the noise coming back. Rory, just stick your hand up again if it hasn't stopped. I think it's stopped, but if it hasn't, please call out again.
It has stopped.
Okay, cool, thank you. Take that another step further to a hair salon, where it's not just about the customer perception, like in the banking example, and I'm just picking part of the hair market with what I describe. It's about, how are you? The cup of tea. The person who cuts your hair is the same person. They understand exactly what you want. There's a bit of an emotional connection there. There's history. So again, what might work in a banking example is not going to work in a haircutting example. However, what I'm doing here, I'm only looking at one dimension so far. If I threw in another dimension, so like organizational values or culture, and if I give an example I saw in my own experience a number of years ago, and I'll bring it back to the haircutting example. So I was trying to understand why things like process excellence, Six Sigma, seem to work very well in companies that originated from a Japanese culture, but were not working well in a company, Rolls-Royce, that is quite dominated by a UK, US, certainly Western European type of culture. And one of the things I found was Gert Hofstadter's cultural dimensions. And there were a couple of dimensions that seemed to explain what I was observing. One was the uncertainty avoidance dimension, and the other was the individuality versus collectivism. And from Gert Hofstadter's research, I saw that in the Japanese culture, there's a high preference for avoiding uncertainty, and it is a lot more collective and individualistic. And I then understood, contrast that with, say, UK, US culture, which tends to be the opposite of that, very comfortable with uncertainty, a lot more individualistic. And I understood why techniques like a Kaizen worked well in a Japanese culture, because it was using the collectivist dimension to overcome the uncertainty avoidance dimension in terms of coming up with new ideas. But transplant that into a culture which is struggling with a lot of the kind of getting conformity, getting consistency, getting adherence, throw a Kaizen into that, and it's like it's pouring petrol on the wrong bonfire. So that's where you can take two very similar industries, very similar purposes, but understanding the cultural dimension then says, well, actually, there's a technique there that won't help us. Maybe there are other techniques that will help us from other contexts. Back to the haircutting example. The way I described that is very much in a culture that prizes individuality. I took the haircutting example, saying to a culture that prized conformity, North Korea, maybe the thing I'm using in my widget manufacture might actually work there, because having conformity, absolute consistency may work. Whole load of practical difficulties with that, but I kind of use that purely to illustrate. Now, obviously, we could start to layer on other dimensions to this, but if I start to build my theoretical model like this, and I start to understand my levels of abstraction, I can start to navigate how an idea from one context, unlikely though it may seem, may actually work in my context, and how an idea from what seems like a very similar context, similar industry, may not work because of the other dimensions. And and this is where, in terms of what I currently see in consulting practice versus this type of conversation, I'm not seeing that level of thinking in those consulting organizations. The other bit to mention is the bits down in the left-hand corner there, sort of kind of fundamental concepts around kind of instability, feedback loops, purpose. I think that those threads run throughout this model, and I'm then applying those concepts in this kind of structure of knowledge, and actually how might this over here actually help my purpose, whereas this bit that seems adjacent doesn't. So kind of makes sense. Where does it all go wrong? So now on to section 2. So this is the first thing I've tended to observe, and if I took my 2 ways of solving a situation, and I've got my 2 axes. So the vertical axis is perception of success. So do other people think I'm doing a good job or not? Do other people think I'm serving my client well? Do other people think the project I've employed my consultancy for is doing a good job? And time along the bottom. So my blue line is something where I've done the right conceptual work. I've come up with an idea. It may seem unlikely, but I think that's going to work. Now, trying to implement that is going to be difficult, because if I'm taking an idea from quite an unlikely source and I'm going to try and implement it in my organization, it may not succeed because this hasn't been tried in this context before. So I may need to change my design. The other challenge I'll have is there's not necessarily a body of people out there that I can pull in externally that have got the experience of implementing idea X. So I'm taking a path which in the short term might be quite difficult, hence the line going down. It might be I set off on a path, I've got my capital allocation, and then 3 or 6 months in, oh dear, I need a bit of a rethink here. I have to go back to my capital process. I'll have a room full of people going, really? You want more money, Jonathan? But 6 months ago, you told us you sounded very confident about what you were. And what's going on in the back of your head? Well, it was like, I had to sound confident because otherwise you wouldn't have given me the money. So what might be a really good idea could be really difficult in the short term, but in the long term, it might be exactly the right thing to do conceptually. Contrast that with the red line, which is where I might have gone to a third party and they said, John, we've done this all over the place. You know, this is what we'll implement X, Y, and Z. Like, okay. The early stage, I think, will look successful because I'm bringing an experienced team of people to implement X, Y, and Z. And up to my kind of judgment line, 12 months in or whatever, it's going to look good because they'll be hitting milestones, probably complying with budget, maybe at the point where I want to apply for a different job internally. The thing is going to look like a success. And this is where I think there's a conflict of interest between the short to medium term and the long term for both people client side in the organization doing the buying and the people in the consultancies doing the selling of. I'll then move on to the second thing that I think goes wrong. Now, so my vertical axis is third-party resources, horizontal axis is time. This is my somewhat cynical, I'm sure a number of you are familiar with the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and I've seen it also used in change terms where you have denial, and then you go through anger and all the various stages, and it goes, obviously my curve goes the other way. And if I'm a customer, the area under the curve is cost. If I'm a supplier, it's revenue. Now, 'twas ever thus in most commercial relationships, but if I just describe some of the dysfunctionalities I've seen and then relate it back to this question of conceptual models. So, sort of things I've observed. So you start a project, senior management agreed with consultancy X, everything's launched, a team arrives. And there are nearly always good reasons for doing that. It is the things that I think a customer looks for is often things like external thinking, get some new ideas, ramp up quickly. Supplier can land me a team of 6, 12, 20 people within a month or so. So there are a number of good reasons for doing that. But then what I've generally seen in the large consultancy assignments is these dysfunctionalities kicking in. So the first one is generally that there'll be a kind of very frenetic phase of a kind of high level design of 3 or 4 months or so. Of course, at the end of that, you get a massive PowerPoint pack. It just proves how busy everybody's been. But often that is based around that kind of, this is the way we do X, Y, and Z for your industry. Quite often the thinking is either context bound to the industry or context bound to the particular individuals involved in the assignment, either client side, the old joke about lend the consultant you watch to tell you the time, or consultant side. What I've experienced, it's leveraging just the experience of the people on that account. You're not sensing the knowledge in the rest of the organization. So you got your 150-page pack, you flick through it, and you go, well, could have probably written that in 15 pages, but anyway. And then you have a think, you think, well, okay, so there's probably 4 or 5 big tough questions we're putting on the table. You think, I think there's probably another 4 or 5 that we need to get on the table, because if we don't, the organization isn't really going to this with eyes wide open. And so you say, well, actually, I think there's another 4 or 5 things that need to go in this pack. No, John, don't worry. We'll deal with that in the next phase. You're like, okay, well, kind of not how I would have done it, but you know, I kind of roll with that. Next phase. And you get towards the end, you go, okay, well, I think there's still 2 of those we still haven't addressed. Don't worry, Jonathan, we'll deal with that in next phase, in detailed design. It's like, whoa. Wasn't this phase detailed design? And then you start to reflect back and you go, okay, so this technology decision that we made back in the last phase, we had 3 options, A, B, or C, and we went for A. And I've now got a room full of people battling away to implement technology A. If I'd gone for B or C, would I maybe have needed a smaller room of people, and possibly one not quite full of so many people from my prime consultancy? And then you reflect back and you go, this thing of kind of maybe skirting over 1 or 2 of the bitter pills, that could have led to quite a fundamental reevaluation of the project. And you think, I can see a commercial conflict of interest here. If I'm a supplier and I've put my industry standard solution, the points of realization, which I think somebody needs to go on mute. The point where I kind of get to the top of the curve here, the disillusionment point, is where the customer's going, oh, okay, I've seen the team expanding. I need to get control of this, but it's at a point where realistically everybody's committed to this. So everybody who's involved is at a point in this project where they've gone back to capital. Yeah, it's going fine, it's fine, we're all right. There's a large amount of equity built up, particularly on the client side, in terms of going to make this a success. So contrast that with a theoretical models approach, where you may decide in the early stages you're going to do something completely different. That could end up with the project being terminated. You could actually end up going to a different supplier. So having a situation where you put on the, as a supplier, you put on the table an industry standard solution, it doesn't quite work, but the working out what needs to be adjusted, needs to be changed, happens as you go through the assignment. It's happening at the points where there's more people working on it, so there's more revenue coming in, but also those realizations are happening. There's a lot more commitment built up to we're going to follow through with this. So this is where I come to the conclusion that I think a better theoretical models approach could avoid a number of these dysfunctionalities, but it would benefit the client more commercially than it would the supplier. And this is why in the next section, I start to look at how as customers, can we be more intelligent customers and inject into the conversation with consulting organizations a theoretical models approach. just before I move on to that next section, an obvious challenge to the last slide is, well, underlying the last slide, I'm assuming there it's a time and materials model. Yes, there are different ways of contracting. I have seen where we've tried to do it on an outcomes basis. I picked the subject for this slide of forecasting software. It could be forecasting anything. It could be forecasting financials, operational performance, whatever. The problem you have is you aren't necessarily involving one third party to do all of the activities that could affect that outcome or improve all of those activities that affect that outcome. And also, there could be things outside everybody's control, world events. So you either end up saying, well, okay, I will pay my supplier, I will reward my supplier, the consultancy, on my end outcome. How close is my forecast to reality? Danger with that is I could be rewarding for just good luck, bad luck in all the other factors that consulting has nothing to do with. So then you say, well, actually, do I make my way further back up there so I get closer to what they are actually influencing? But then you get to 2 slides ago, you're starting to get more back to have I successfully implemented something rather than is what I have implemented successful. So very quickly, issues I think there are is dislocations between short-term, long-term, dislocations between commercial interests of the supplier, customer, what to do about it. That's what I'll cover now in the next few slides. So I think there's something about how we structure projects. I think there's something here about the in-house expertise that customers, large organizations buying consulting services have, and cheeky kind of challenge at the end in terms of what could we do as a society to help influence this debate. So, and I'm sure with enough brain power, we could probably come up with something better than this, but this was my initial, well, how would I restructure? So imagine I've got a transformation project. How do I set that up? A lot of the transformation projects I worked in have been one blob. So yeah, there's been work streams, there's been different parties, Rolls-Royce third parties involved, but it's often been one project team. What I'm thinking here is that we actually build in a separation here between the design team and the implementation team. And we actually also put in a design challenge team. And I've got my little feedback loops between all those areas. Now, I think there's a big thing here about leadership and behaviors, because what you'd want in this type of model is constructive challenge between the different parties, but a recognition of the respective roles, so that design is responsible for design, implementation is responsible for implementation. There's also a thing here of being very, very clear about what the ground rules are. So it might be that we get to a stage in the project where we've done our feedback loops, we've kept checking, is what we're developing, is it the right thing? The answer is no. We may stop the project, we may change direction, and we may anyway want to change where we're getting our third-party implementation support from in the implementation organization box. So I think there's a thing here about being clear about the ground rules, so that the third party that is likely to be supporting us in the implementation organization don't get too carried away with, well, we're on phase 0, so we're going to be on all the other phases, and it's built into the revenue forecast and everything else. So I think there's a lot here about making this sort of model work, which is about leadership behaviors, expectations. There's also about the types of thinking. So in the design organization, we'd probably want people from 2 or 3 or 4 different either organizations or sources. So it could be a mixture of maybe a third party, maybe a niche consultancy, maybe an individual consultant, maybe an industry thinker. So we're getting the kind of cross-fertilization of ideas. The feedback loops, I think, between the internal organization and the external world are also very important, so that we don't kind of get into kind of any ivory tower sort of scenario where we get a situation where the implementation organization is very close to the organization, is coming back and going, what you're recommending just won't work. The design organization has to have that same level of conversation, I think, there. In terms of how we make this work and how actually, where would the theoretical models idea fit? So sort of stuff I was exploring in section 1, where would that fit then? That's what I want to unpack a little bit more on the next idea. So the ideas I put there is having an in-house consultancy team, possibly with the idea at the bottom, which is what I call the kind of retained broker, which would, my idea there is it's more of an individual niche player, so somebody who hasn't got a vested interest in selling kind of large quantities of human labor to help with the implementation of stuff. So somebody who can operate with that level of independence. The in-house consultancy team, I see that as a mixture of skills. So people who understand the consultancy market, people who understand the organization, people who can start to build and understand the theoretical models that we're talking about here, and work with people outside the organization to start to kind of build a common model. I think the other things that are really key to this is one of the words I've used on the slide there is credibility, another one is relationships. I think the internal consultancy idea only really works if it is led in a way that the individuals leading that team have very strong relationships with the senior individuals within the organization that would normally go out and make decisions to employ a third party to help with stuff. I think the internal consultancy has to be seen internally as the way of getting things done and a trusted partner. So if the head of the internal consultancy says, actually, no, that is not the right route to go, I think we ought to structure the project in that way. They have the credibility and trust to do that. Where this would go wrong is if it's seen as a gatekeeper, because then I think it falls into the model of chief exec has dinner with senior partner of consultancy X, decides to do an assignment, and then the internal consultancy team is just seen as a gate to get through, in the same ways that sometimes purchasing is seen as a gate to get through. And it's like, how do we work together to get this through? So for me, that's, I think, A, this is really hard to do. And B, I think that is the big trap to avoid. It just becoming a kind of gatekeeper service. My last one is rather kind of cheeky challenge to us is, what ways could we influence the client side? Because when so the kind of the last parts of my argument were it ought to be the clients have the highest interest in changing the dynamic here. There's certain things the clients need to do, but there's also a signal into the marketplace from that. And this is where I think, and this is where I have tried to have the conversation with one or two senior individuals in consulting organizations. It's usually the dynamic of the facial expression says, I need to listen to Jonathan because he's a manager in the client organization. So I need to be polite and listen, but that's great, Jonathan. Off to my next opportunity to sell is generally how it feels. This is where I think the large consultancies will only start to change if they see clients changing and there are more direct signals into the consultancy base to say, no, what we want is conceptual models. So rather than come and tell us what your industry solution is, oh yeah, could everybody go on mute? I think that's background noise again. It says to the consultancy market, well, actually, that's all very interesting, but can you tell me what you're doing on theoretical models? Can you explain how you navigate all the stuff I was kind of articulating earlier? So my last bit is, how could we use the influence we have to influence the kind of buy side of the market? Okay, that's my last slide. So I think I now pass to you, John, to facilitate the debate.
You can run out of slides without necessarily running out of words, Jonathan.
Story of my life.
So welcome the latecomers. Nice to see you all. Do you want to stop sharing, Jonathan?
Yeah.
All the happy faces smiling around the world. And if you're Hey there, could you put yourself on mute or we'll do it for you? There you are, solved it. Robin, you've come straight in with your hand up there. I just before you go, I'm sort of, thank you, Jonathan. That was great. I actually managed to keep up with nearly all of it. In 1989, I decided that I wanted to leave what was the Royal Bank of Scotland and finish my doctorate. And I went and saw the HR director because the strategy director had already said yes. And I went and saw the HR director and he said, and this was an organisation then of 100,000 people with 3,000 local offices, etc. And I can't remember his name, he was a Scouser, and he said, well, good luck with that. I can't imagine what possible use you think the bank will have for those sort of skills, but good luck anyway. And sent me on my way. So there is something about better clients does spring quite readily to mind in that sense. So thank you, Jonathan. Robin, we'll go straight in with you. Crack on.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'd just like to reinforce your presentation with two examples from my own experience. Firstly, as a chartered registered safety practitioner in a consulting environment, 10 years ago now, I will name names, shame the companies, no problem with that. Working with Siemens Wind Power UK on one of their offshore wind sites as just the site EHS advisor. Quite easy money for me, quite liked it, nothing too strenuous, and hopefully doing some good things. Globally, though, they wanted to improve their safety performance and activities. They had a new boss come in, head of health and safety, and she brought in Deloitte as a big consultancy to come and do this for us. And after the first couple of weeks, they'd done a couple of site visits, and they came to our site. And talking to this young lady and explaining myself and my experiences, and she said, "Oh yes, well, a couple of months ago I was a hairdresser, but didn't really like that, so I left." And clearly, this is how the big Deloittes of the world work. They just get the good contracts on their name and send in the cheapest possible person on the payroll to go and actually deliver the goods.
Yes, you tend to get that dynamic where you'll get somebody who kind of sells the piece of work, who has got generally kind of senior manager, director, partner, got a fair bit of experience, but subject to some of the dysfunctionality. But then you got very much a pyramid structure where you got kind of squadrons of graduates at the bottom, and then it gets very narrow as you go up through the pyramid.
The outcome of that was I explained what I was doing on my particular site. She said, "Oh, that's very interesting," took it away. 3 weeks later, it got pushed back out to all the other sites saying this is what we should be doing. Clearly on 4 times, 5 times my day rate, I got a bit pissed off with that and I left. The head of health and safety left 6 months later, so I think that they had that disillusionment and dive bombed.
Yes, yeah.
Second example is what I'm doing now, which is working with a group of colleagues from, again, more than 10 years ago. They have their own consultancy, and we, as a team of about 15, are now embedded within BP in their renewables growth team, who are the ones who go out looking for opportunities to build wind farms. As a team, we have decades and decades of experience doing just this. BP, being an oil and gas giant, have wanted to do their greenification, and basically brought us in. And it's not as a consultancy role, but we're there to support their activities, to teach them, to mentor them through and show them how to do it in the long run. So hopefully that's the second side of your example of how good consultancy could work. And so far, I think we've been so successful. 6 months in, another 18 months to go.
Yeah, it's a good point you make, actually, about the kind of diversity that there is. And I'd very much focus on the kind of large organizations in the slide deck. Like you, I've had some very good experiences. I'm currently working with an individual who's a very experienced project manager, but it's very much a niche consultancy, and there's none of that kind of sales pipeline in terms of 2 weeks' time they'll be trying to sell you another couple of people and another couple of people after that. It's very much a highly experienced niche. So yeah, I know what you mean. There's a lot of there's a lot of diversity once you're outside the big players.
That was it from me.
Cool, thank you.
If I leap back in at this point, so I'm looking at my screen and I can see Professor John Oakland, who like me has built a career out of being both a practitioner and a thinker, and John, unlike me, employs a wide range of people in his, so again, somebody's trying to.
Yeah. So I don't know what the question is, John, but I'll try and give you an answer. Just a background then. So I'm very old and we've been in business as now called the Oakland Group for over 35 years. And our whole mantra has been about helping large complex organizations to improve their performance. And that can be any aspects, but obviously is about reducing costs, improving quality, improving delivery performance and so on. And over that 35, 40 year period, we've worked with some of the largest global operations in the world, the Airbuses of this world, the ABB, Shell, Exxon, you name it. And we've had people literally all over the world, crawling all over factories and so on. And in the last 5 years, we've transformed our business into data integrators. In other words, we to survive, we have to move with the time. So over that time, we've learned how to move with the market and do what our clients want. I thought Jonathan's attempts to develop the theoretical models around some of these problems were admirable. And John Beckford said at the beginning, after you've given a talk, you then start an argument. I'm not wanting to start an argument, but I will say this. I don't know about this. These are theoretical models or not, but they're certainly our practical experience. The problem is, in my view, and I think it relates very much to what Jonathan was saying, that many large complex organizations like Rolls-Royce seem to think they need large complex consultancy organizations to help them improve.
Yeah.
And this blind in the client organization that has that view, or at least in some very senior people, this blinds their logical thinking with the mantra, which is not much better than nobody ever got the sack in Airbus by employing McKinsey, but you employ the Oakland Group. Who are they? And so that helps the McKinseys of this world, the Bostons of this world, KPMG, Deloitte. You mentioned them all, EY, PwC, and this is in spite of repeated experience of being disappointed by the results. The number of times we've been brought in to sort out a not inconsiderable mess that's been brought about by the application of I'm a Yorkshireman, so I'll say it as it. I can always tell a Yorkshireman, but I can't tell him much, as they say. But in spite of this experience, it's because when you get these large organizations, large consultancies, just like Jonathan says, they send somebody round who doesn't necessarily know anything about what the requirements of that project are. So large consultancies have to structure themselves in some sort of way. And as Jonathan quite rightly said, it's always industry-wise. So you go to the Management Consultants Association meetings and you meet the EY aerospace guy or the automotive guy, and they know all about automotive engineering. They know everything about that industry. But then you start talking to them about how do you control variation to stop oil leaks in a manufacturing organization that makes motor cars. And it's like you've asked them how you could get to the moon next week. And they don't have the expertise in the area that is needed. And they often For example, PwC will have a huge public sector organization with a head of the public sector organization. And this individual then runs an outfit that knows all about health, local authorities, digging roads up, the lot. So when we've worked with really top guys throughout large complex organizations, and I can almost have them on the fingers of two hands. Guys like Bill Black, the Senior Vice President, Quality and Operational Excellence of Airbus, and then he was headhunted to do the same job in ABB. John Taylor was Chief Executive of Exxon, and then Borealis. John Holloway, UK President of in Exxon, and Bob Wilson. A whole bunch of guys in LM Wind, Hiab, Shell, and they've all realized that if they've got a huge challenge, like we need to improve the quality, we're about to build an A380 aeroplane, which is like nothing we've ever built in the world. And if we don't get the quality management of that right, these things are going to start dropping out of the sky. You'll notice they've never put 800 seats in an A380, which they said they were going to do, because they daren't do it, and they not solve a lot of those quality problems. But the best chance you get of having solved that problem is to at least go out and find somebody who knows about quality management. Not somebody who's just been, as Jonathan said, a bloody hairdresser. So what are the large consultancies driven by? They're driven by getting people in, growing tendons in the organization, ligaments, so you can't get rid of them. They encourage a reliance on in the client on their bodies, really, that they've infiltrated into the organization, and they're not worried about whether they've got the expertise or not. Now, if that doesn't start an argument, I don't know what will. But I think that is the nub of the problem.
I think there's a lot to be said for that, John, and I think I'm sort of sitting here and I'm listening very carefully to all this. Because as a consultant for 30 odd years, I see my job as being to make myself redundant. If the organisation still needs me, then I'm doing the wrong thing, and I think I probably inherited that from Stafford as a concept. I think it's ingrained, Vanilla, am I right? But certainly somewhere in Stafford's writing. And I thought, that's really powerful. I don't want to work that hard. There's a lot there. What I've been reading in the chat is quite interesting, because talking of that, we need to find somebody with the expertise, and both Louise, Louise has made a point about experience, and Tanya's followed it up. I think Goran followed it up as well. And what's the experience is really, really interesting. As a friend of mine, I was talking to her about her father, and he'd worked for Standard Chartered Bank, and he'd been for 33 years in Dubai, and it was, the question was, does he have 33 years experience, or does he have 1 year's experience 33 times? And so there's a question mark around experience for me, and a question mark around if what you've learned is to repeat what you've seen before, how does that help the client who already knows how badly they're currently doing it, but they want to be able to do it better? And if you're not bringing a conceptual or theoretical model of better into the argument, then what on earth are you doing there, would be my kind of question. So James, you have your hand up and you've been patiently waiting, so crack in.
Yeah, I mean, I won't bore everyone with swapping all my stories about big organizations and consulting, because I've also got the that same background, and I actually went into consulting because of some of John Oakland's guys working in the organization I was in, who gave me some advice, and in 1994 I went out on my own. The fact that the big organizations, and you can expand them to the big educational organizations as well, like INSEAD and whoever else, they're visited or they're utilized not because of their efficacy, but because of the comfort that they supply. You know, I once, a very large gas supplier in the UK, we pitched for their business and they went to INSEAD to get their leadership training. And then when they came back and it didn't stick, they came to us to make it stick. But they wanted to go to INSEAD because the directors wanted to have, I went to INSEAD on their CVs. So, and I also worked with another guy who, they had a load of data, they couldn't access the data. We went in, we accessed the data. They paid McKinsey's £1 million to write them a strategy, which was rendered null and void by opening up the data that McKinsey had ignored. So, you know, the fact that it's broken and very severely broken is, I thought, relatively well kind of known. And I guess the question would be is, who is the standout organization to solve your problem? Because if they're not really stand out, if you can't go, we need to go to McKinsey's to solve this problem, it means they haven't got a standout solution. It just means they're McKinsey's and they can cut, and you can choose from McKinsey, PwC, Deloitte's, you know, list them all off, because you're just choosing which comfort blanket you want.
So James, does that then take us, so another thread coming out of what Jonathan was saying that occurred to me, and I go back to my sort of you know, leaving the bank story. I don't know how many people Rolls-Royce employs now, Jonathan. I was going to say how many people work at Rolls-Royce, but we know it's only you. The number of people employed, and the skill set and the knowledge set and the degree to which an organisation of, I had to pick a number, 50,000 people, actually has the right people in leadership and management, or has the wrong people. Because if organisations are dependent to the degree that you've outlined, that John Oakland has outlined, on bringing in these supposedly clever consultancies, then what on earth are those people doing in charge? Because they clearly haven't got a ready clue what they're doing.
And I think it's as James and John were articulating, there's a comfort blanket aspect, and it does remind me of when I was at KPMG in the 90s, and the latter part of that was in the IT assurance unit, and the running joke was there, nobody got the sack for implementing IBM. And it's a similar thing with the large consultants. And back to your question on about roles, so we got north of 40,000 employees globally. Often you do have enough external referencing inside the walls. You've got to find the people, because in an organization of that size, not everybody's been there for 20, 30 years. You already have within your walls a number of people who've worked elsewhere. And even if you need, or even if you decide you need the particular skills of a consultant, well, go into a market and buy them. And have them on the payroll, because you'll pay a fraction of what you pay in terms of a daily rate to one of the large consulting organisations.
If I could just, John, if just say, I wrote a strategy for an organisation that I was employed by, that John worked for, that changed their global strategy completely. I mean, revolutionised the business. But I was a humble UK guy in a global organization who was facing a particular problem. And when I wrote the strategy, there was a lot of, oh, no, I'm not too sure we want to do that, because it really changed the ethos of the business. So they brought in McKinsey. And they brought in McKinsey that went round and to check to see whether what I'd written and what I was saying was correct or not.
Yeah.
And you know, the company ended up going in that direction, and I ended up leaving and earning 3 times what I was being paid annually, because I wasn't to the young people's point of view. I was 34 at the time. I wasn't significantly high enough in the sort of food chain to be relied upon to have a good enough thing that anyone would base their career on, of suggesting it to the chairman of the global organization. And in fact, when the strategy was presented, I went to Geneva and sat outside the waiting room to see the chairman, whilst my boss, who didn't really understand the strategy, went in and explained it to him, and I was outside in case he needed to have it explained.
Yes.
So that takes us very nicely to Tanya's question, because Tanya's put in the chat, what is it the senior people in the consultancies are doing? Because I'd like to think, in my utopian view of the world, of course, that they're thinking grand thoughts and developing grand ideas and thinking deeply about the nature of the problem with the client. My experience of them is that they're working out how to send an even bigger bill next month than they did this month, and how on earth they're going to sell enough to feed all the junior consultants they've just recruited out of the School of Business and Economics at Loughborough. Because Tanya and Rory will both be looking for jobs in the next sort of couple of years. And a life as an itinerant consultant obviously has massive appeal.
John, I like to come in there because I think you've hit the nail on the head. And it's something that client organizations, especially large client organizations, need to start thinking about very carefully. Just people have described their own experiences. So I'll use one we had with Shell and Booz Allen Hamilton. At the time, Shell were down near the Savoy Hotel, as were Booz Allen Hamilton, and the senior partner in Booz Allen Hamilton had a corridor right straight through a door into Shell. And every year used to go in and speak to the guys and say, how big is the budget going to be this year that Shell's going to spend with Booz Allen Hamilton? How many millions of pounds? Well, Shell, and that happened every year. And this guy was very well paid by Booz Allen Hamilton because he used to deliver that amount. We got involved because they were having, Shell Services International were having huge quality problems, which Booz Allen couldn't solve. And by a means I won't bore you with, we got involved. So Shell eventually said, you know what, you guys seem to know more about this than anybody else, so we'd like to employ you on this job. But we're Shell. We're global. We've got 180,000 employees worldwide in 100 different countries, and you're not big enough to take us on. So we'd like you to partner with a very large consultancy so that, you're not going to screw this up. And that happened to be Booz Allen Hamilton. We did all the work, and in the end, they turned around and said, why have we got Booz Allen Hamilton on this work? Because they're adding no value whatsoever. And this particular partner, a lot of this work was in Houston, and he used to fly first class to Houston every week to have these meetings with the Shell guys. We were traveling economy and doing all the work, and he was going back with the glory. In the end, Booz Allen came to us and said, we'd like to work with you in other clients because we've got other clients that we don't know what we're doing in either. Now, this is not a jaundiced tale. It happened time and time again. I remember we turned that on its head. We were invited to solve a problem in resources in the BBC. These are the people who run studios and outside broadcasts. And we said, the BBC might not think we're big enough to solve this problem. So guess what? We brought Booz Allen in to that work just so that the BBC would feel comfortable about having a right big brother at the side of us to do this. There's something conceptually, talking about theoretical models, there's something conceptually wrong with the thinking that is ingrained in this bar that's been created, steel of rod that's bolted between the Shells and the Booz Allen Hamiltons, between the Home Office and PwC or whatever, that prevents them from understanding what this is all about, and the fact that they need expertise they're not getting.
They tend to populate. So if you look at McKinsey, are brilliant at populating organisations with their own people, who then appoint McKinsey to come along and solve the problems. And as a sort of as an exercise in modern imperialism, it's quite brilliant. We may not like it when countries do it, but we see it happening all the time with the big consultancies, and it's not a bad strategy. I think. I mean, I'm going to go to Rory in just a second. He's had a hand up a while. But one of the things I want us to get to is, a controversial question maybe, are there theoretical models that should be being used? And if there are, should they be being, who should they be being used by? And what does that then say about the nature of the consulting relationship? Because I think there is something about developing cleverer clients. And Richard, I responded to you in the chat. If my job is to make myself redundant, then the trick of life is surely to teach the client to be as clever as me, so I don't have to go back again. And they may not be as clever as me, but they can make them clever enough that they don't need me over time. So Rory, what's your point?
I wanted to talk about whether size matters, and because I constantly hear this thing about big companies, big companies, big companies, big companies, and the fundamental thing is that does a consultancy get big because it's good at consultancy, or good because it's good at building a consultancy business? And I think that if these big companies are consistently working with bigger and bigger clients, they are dealing with more wicked problems. And the problem with wicked problems is that they are never fully solved. And it's very difficult to see whether a solution has actually worked, which means that it's far easier for McKinsey and the bigger consulting firms to be able to manipulate the results and the current conditions to say, well, we've implemented this scheme and you've seen an improvement. How easy is it to actually say, well, this is the thing that has made it improve? Because you're dealing with such a complex environment. This is a problem that I had listening to an economics podcast about advertising, is that a company will put out an advertising plan or an advertising campaign, but at the same time, they've also got 7 other campaigns going on, or 7 other different projects and initiatives. So it's very difficult to see what is actually having the principal effect. So I think, just to summarize, my one question is, does size matter? Because are these companies just good at building consultancy firms, or are they actually good at consulting?
I suspect the answer is they vary. I actually really like that. Where that got my head, Rory, was around motivation and measurement. So why is the consultancy there in the first place? Why is the help needed? I think there's a challenge to definition of what we might call call consultancy, and how that's actually defined as an activity, because it's not a terribly pure professional or definition of anything. I'm a consultant, you are all consultants, but what on earth do we mean by what we're saying? And if you ask the chief executive, I guess, of any consultancy, if you spoke to Richard Cordroy, John's chief exec, I'm sure John expects me to grow the business. Now, I also know that John expects Richard to grow the business ethically, in the sense of doing good things for clients that are valuable to those clients, because I know them well enough to be able to say that. But that ethical point is possibly where we need to go with this. Any Muppet can grow a consulting business in delivering operational improvement stuff which works in the relatively short term. It's not difficult. Most organizations are badly organized, badly run, and horribly inefficient. So finding things to improve is not hard. Embedding improvement in the organization so that it sustains after you're no longer there is a very different proposition. And I think that's where our expertise as cyberneticians and our understanding of the world as cyberneticians should be the thing that makes the difference between, let's call it good consultancy, bad consultancy, or effective consultancy and ineffective consultancy.
Yeah, John,
transfer of knowledge into the client. Sorry, John.
Well, you've raised a very good point there. So how big do you want to get? Big in turnover, or big in your ability to, so to influence people. So if you're still doing what you were always good at 10 years ago, but because of your good marketing and sales processes, you're now doing it to 10 times more companies. You're not trying to do strategy, operational excellence, HR, finance, the lot. I'm going to hold this up. This is one of my Bible books. I don't know if you can see that. Have you ever, you need to read this, you guys. It's called Dangerous Company, the consultancy powerhouses and the businesses they save and ruin. And it's all about the growth of the McKinseys of this world, the Bains of this world, and their strategies for growth, which in my view are all about good business growth practice, if you like, but not with the client's best interest at heart. I think if you're going to grow a consultancy practice, you should attempt to widen your client base in what you're the experts in what you're doing, not dilute that expertise by trying to be experts to everything. It's the hairdresser thing that Jonathan quite eloquently talked about. It's crazy. And that book has loads of brilliant true stories. People who did things they finished up in jail with. The interesting thing, you may remember the Guinness case, it was the Guinness people, the client, who finished up in jail instead of the Bain Capital people who should have finished up in jail. So, yeah, we want to grow any business, but we want to grow that business by expanding our influence on what we do well, not on what we can't do because it makes money. I'm sorry, I've gone on a bit.
That's fine.
Touched a few buttons.
Good. Can I bring John Hicks? Where in France are you? Because Vanilla is also in France, and I'm wondering how far apart you two are.
I think we're quite far apart. Elena once mentioned that she was in the south, I believe. Are you in the south? Or I'm in Paris. It's a great evening here. Thanks a lot. And John, I was wondering, John Oakland, if you could put the name of that book you just mentioned into the chat, that would be very useful. I didn't know it actually. No, I mean, one thing that's true in France, which I think is obviously much less true in America, and it's becoming less and less true in the UK as days go by, is that it's very expensive to hire. You know, when you hire someone in France, your cost is at least 2 times their salary, and actually I think it's a bit more. And then also, if you have to get rid of full-time staff for economic reasons, you're then blocked from hiring anybody else for a certain amount of time. So, I mean, there is an inflexibility in labour laws, which actually I'm very in favour of, which means that, you know, you go into a bank in France, it's about 60 to 70% external people, consultants, if not more. And some of them are really, they won't be directors, but they will be like project managers and things like that. I think in a way that's a bit of, you know, so the whole thing to me, in a way, it's a bit of a racket to avoid social responsibility. On the level of you know, like, we don't want to hire graduates, just send them through a consulting firm so we can sack them with a day's notice.
I think there's a certainly in this country the on cost of employment. If you're a public sector employer, the on cost of employment is somewhere around 38 to 40% at the moment, pensions, etc. And even in this country, people are very difficult to get rid of. Not quite as difficult as France, but so there's a sort of financial disincentive to organisations to employ people,
Sure.
and hence the growth of consultancy.
I mean, I've got a case at the moment where I was, I'm not going to give any names or anything, but wanted to hire someone who's actually at the moment he's doing a freelance consulting job. We would save probably 30k a year by giving him a job, but we can't do it because there's a hiring freeze. But they're okay to sort of keep the other thing going. So that's you know, it's an odd world.
Very functional budgeting. So I think John Randall, you had your hand up next. John Hicks, you might want to put yours down, and then Rory, you'll follow John Randall.
Cool. So I think firstly I have to credit Robin with the hairdresser example, but it is a really good example, and I know exactly what you mean. Just back to Rory's question about kind of the differences between small and large, and the comments you were making, John, and the book reference, which I will go and get. But I think certainly in my experience, I have sensed different motivations. So where I've been dealing with smaller consultancies focused in a particular area, there's been a lot more motivation around wanting to help the client, wanting to deploy then individuals' own knowledge. Whereas with the large organizations, I think the motivation at the top is making money. And to do that, you grow the size of the organization, and I think that then takes you into the position of hiring a lot of inexperienced people purely to get the volumes of heads on the account to then justify the level of billings, and hence all this kind of frenetic busyness and huge PowerPoint packs, but not much in terms of quality of thinking behind that. So I think it comes down to the motivations of the people who are leading the respective large versus small organizations.
Thank you. Rory.
Okay, so two things about the reason that everything is external nowadays. The one is the trend of flexibility, which I think can sort of come down to the fact that I think we as a society are anticipating things to change faster and faster and faster, particularly, as I said, wicked world, everything's interacting constantly. So that's why they want the ability to have staff that can be fired at the drop of a hat, to be able to expand and contract very quickly. And the other part, which goes into sort of a bit of a tangent, is ethics. Because I was listening to a podcast with Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein. And one of the things that Brett Weinstein mentioned about ethics is that companies are ethical to the extent of which they are scrutinized. And that if you look at a lot of big companies at the moment, their focus is eco-friendly environment, but they still have 90% of their products made in sweatshops in Far East Asia because there's no scrutiny on that. So in terms of having this majority external workforce that can be fired at the drop of a hat, that's extremely flexible, that comes to the fact that companies often find their competitive advantages in doing unethical things of which aren't scrutinized and of which other companies are not yet doing. So that was my comment on the increased flexibility in business.
Thanks, Rory. So if I build on that, then I'm going to call Dr. Dewhurst in just a moment. I'll give him fair warning at this point. That there's a man invented God in his own image in order to control the behavior of other people. And there's a sort of the ethical behavior to which you pointed. There's an assumption that we, and there is in fact a lot of practice that says, yeah, we rely on external regulation to make people behave in the ways that we want them to. And that's a very sort of centralized and dictatorial, authoritarian, anti-libertarian way of understanding society and organizations. And there's been a really interesting sort of thread running through the chat for the last 5-10 minutes around why don't organizations use the VSM? And I will put my hand up, and those of you who know me will know that my thinking when I'm working with an organization is always informed by my understanding and interpretation of the VSM, and I stress understanding and interpretation, because there is no single interpretation that is sort of universally accepted, and I'm sure that people would violently disagree with certain parts of mine. But what that gets us when we play with that is we have an understanding of the philosophy that underpins the development of the VSM, which talks about autonomy, which talks about societal responsibility, which talks about ethics, which talks about people and human behavior, as well as talking about the stuff, structure and information. So when we embrace the philosophy that underpins our theoretical model, we also can embrace more effectively the behaviors that then go with it that might make it work in practice. And I would argue that certainly when we look at some of the behavior of people in organizations, the absence of any ethical philosophy underpinning their work is the thing that drives some of the, let's call them strange behaviors that we might observe. So, lecture over. David Dewhurst, do you have some things to say? Because you've been saying a lot of them. And then Mick Ashby, I will come to you.
Well, I always have things to say, don't I? Right, well, many of my best friends, as they say, over the last few decades have been management consultants. And you do realize that it's not just academics who rubbish other people in their field, but then this happens with lots of professions. But actually, my colleagues talking about the big kids do seem pretty plausible. So how do you deal with this large company mentality? I suppose you have to get in there and tell your story of the analysis of what's going on, be the definer. If in outside the jungle, the law is define or be defined. I used to find before I was an Ofsted inspector that if I talked to kids about classroom dynamics and me being the biggest monkey, it didn't stop me being the biggest monkey or trying not to be the alpha monkey. The other thing I found is that some management consultants actually give the same solution virtually to all their clients, or they may present it as bespoke, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. There are a lot of commonalities in human errors, and what I noticed recently in one of the last papers by the first Nobel Prize Nobel Prize winner, woman Memorial Prize in economics, Eleanor Ostrom, was she was interested in identifying settings, political, social, economic settings for which her expertise was suitable. And you're probably not going to read and follow this up, but if you do, you'll find about 30 characteristics which she wanted to look at in particular organizations, settings, whatever, in order to decide whether they were right for her form of consultancy. I hope that helps to confuse things for everybody. It's much easier to be fluent when you know less about a subject.
Thank you. Mick.
Yeah, thanks. When people started mentioning ethics, that just pressed a whole load of buttons on me. I believe strongly that absolutely no corporation can be ethical if it's seeking to maximize profits. They'll spend quite a lot of money to look very ethical, and they'll say all the right words, and they'll have all their compliance departments and everything. But I've worked for rather large, shall I say, bluish corporation for 25 years. And to be honest, the only reason that they haven't already sold one of my kidneys is because it's illegal. It's the only reason.
So some of us might ask, why on earth you work for them?
I need the slave tokens to buy the cat food.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the problem is that we live in a world where we are expected to and perhaps we expect of ourselves that we sacrifice some of our principles on the altar of getting paid at the end of the month. And it perhaps takes, when I used to teach MBA classes 25 years ago, one of my favorite questions to ask people was, how many of you have ever risked your job for a principle? And for me, When you're a jobbing consultant with a small business, effectively all you've got to rely on is your integrity. So you kind of have to be able to say, I will walk away from this piece of work because I don't know how to do it, or I don't think it needs doing, or whatever. That's very much more difficult when you're in the gilded cage of a large organization that handcuffs you to a pension plan at the age of 21 before you're wise enough to make an intelligent decision. And of course, what you have to recognize is that it'll spit you out when it's had enough of you. So it expects loyalty from you, but you must not expect loyalty from it, because you ain't going to get it, which is sort of deeply disturbing when you suddenly realize that that's what's going on. So Tanya and
John, I've got to go in a minute.
Sorry, John.
I've got to go in a minute. So there's just one thing. I think we can get too deep into the conceptualization here if we're not careful. The triangle of process, people, technology is everything to me in consulting. And if you go to a doctor, if you've got stomachache, you go to a doctor, it turns out you've got bowel cancer. The chances are you will want a person who's an expert in bowel cancer to perform the operation. You're not likely to be too happy if you're lying on the preparatory bed and you told a gynecologist is going to do it, or a brain surgeon. And that's what this is about. When organizations have a problem, they've got a cancer in their bowel, or they've got real problems of quality, they're really disturbing their customers' happiness about what they're doing, their costs are too high, their wastages are high, whatever it is, they need an expert in that field. And it's incumbent upon both the client and the consultancy to look at the process, people, technology triangle and get that right. It's not that difficult, because if you go to a consultant and start talking about a particular problem in a technology area or a process area, it soon becomes blindingly obvious whether they know anything or not about it. and many clients seem to have the ability to ignore the fact that I've realized this person is not an expertise. What you want to hear from your clients, your prospective clients as a consultant, is you seem to know more about this than anyone else. That's the person you want. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go.
Thanks for joining us, John. I shall see you again shortly.
Pleasure. Indeed.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye. So that's really interesting, because I picked up from John's work many years ago the notion of an operational definition. So if we're going to measure something or understand something like this, actually damn well define what the thing is that we're working on. And what I'm minded to do at this point is look and say, well, when a client is inviting somebody in, at what stage of their problem solving are they? Because you've got in simple terms, you've got two stages. You've got, picking up John's bowel cancer reference, we're picking up then, are you at the stage as a chief executive, or is your client at the stage where they are trying to understand the nature of the problem that they think they're experiencing? Or are they at the stage of trying to do something about the problem that they have now diagnosed? And one of my interesting things I experience is that you quite often get phone calls from large companies saying, we've got a problem with X and we'd like you to come and solve it. And you sort of, I'll pop in. So you stick your head through the door and drink some coffee, and they tell you what's going on. I say, well, your diagnosis is wrong. So it doesn't matter how many times you sort of beat that surf, it's never going to get any better, because actually you're addressing the wrong problem. So there's a sort of improvement consultancy which assumes that the client has correctly identified what the problem is, and then there's maybe some diagnostic consultancy that should be happening before that, and that might be where we pick up the thread of getting better clients. So how do we make the client more effective in procuring consultancy? Well, we actually make them get to think about the nature of the problem somewhat differently. So I'm going to go to Rory, because you're top left, then Boris, you follow.
I will just quickly agree with you with what you said there about diagnosis and solution. However, I think that going back to the principles of wicked problems, that the act of defining a problem is in essence its solution. So I think there is a link there, and they're not entirely separate. I want to join make my contribution to the Cybernetics Society book club and say that everybody needs to read this book, Range, how generalists triumph in a specialized world. Because frankly, I was getting a little bit annoyed about the constant talk of the need for experts, and to try not to completely try and rattle off everything that's in this book, because this book will tell you that that's just totally wrong. And one of the reasons is because of the wicked world that we live in, and that being a business consultant and running a business is very different to playing tennis, where you've got a kind learning environment where things are very particular and very well outlined, and there's not a huge amount of competing and interdependent variables. But in the wicked world, which is the world that we live in, world of business and organizations, you have all of these intercompeting problems. It's a wicked learning environment, and sometimes experts aren't actually experts. So please, everybody read that book. I would say that it's the best book that I've ever read. It's been the most influential for me. But one of the things I wanted, if I just give an example, I'll give an example. I won't say what it's relevant to. You can decide that for yourself. Is that it was talking about in the book about a problem with a tumor. Now, the problem with this tumor is that it needed a certain amount of radiation in order to destroy the tumor. It was malignant, it would have killed the person. It couldn't be operated on, you had to destroy it with radiation. The problem is that if they had done it in a single straight line of just one ray of radiation, it would have killed the tumor, but it would have killed all of the surrounding cells. So that was a big problem. So the problem outlined was, okay, so how do we deal with this tumor? And the author then presented a completely unrelated story of a village that had a house that was on fire. And the problem is that the villagers were going up to the lake to fill up their buckets of water and then throw it on the fire one at a time. That wasn't working. The fire wasn't going down. So one of the guys said, right, everybody stop. What we need to do is everybody fill up your buckets of water and then wait by the house that's on fire, and wait until everybody has their buckets of water. And when everybody's got their buckets of water, throw it on the house exactly the same time. How does that relate to curing cancer and dealing with a malignant tumor? Well, how it relates is the fact that the way to destroy the tumor was to take lots of lower beams of radiation and hit it from multiple angles so that the surrounding cells remained unscathed, but the point at which they concentrated had enough radiation to kill the tumor cells. Now, the general thing that I'm trying to get across there is that expertise is sometimes a load of absolute tosh, because firefighting on the surface seems like it has absolutely nothing to do with cancer, but at the same time, in the right scenario, it has everything to do with fighting cancer.
That's cool. I think there's Peter Checkland, I think it was, said there are no experts in systems thinking, and I think you described earlier in the session, Rory, the notion of the wicked problem, and wicked problems do not lend themselves to functional expertise, but you do need then a spread of knowledge, a spread of insight, and a lot of the work that we do in cybernetics really has its roots in that bringing together disparate expertise to share an understanding of the problem, and in that sense, if not solve it, dissolve it, to quote Stafford again, and kind of make it go away, or at the very least ameliorate it so that it lends itself to improvement later. So we can move the problem if we can't solve it or make it go away. So we need this blend of higher order insight that lets us grasp the complexity of the thing that we're considering, whilst at the same time recognizing that we may just need a bloke with a really sharp knife and very, very steady hands who is actually able to excise the thing once we've defined properly where it is and what it is we need to do with it. So we have those sort of two contrasting things going on. Boris, it's your turn. You're on mute, my friend.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. First, I'd like to say thank you for Randall for your really clear talking and model you presented because I like thinking in models. You know, it's a little bit easier to understand things. You know, I'm not from English-speaking area, so I'm also thankful to John that he provided subtitles. In this way, I understood much more than I understood on other sessions where this was not present. But anyway, I have to ask Randall if I understood right what he was talking about today. I understood that you presented, Randall, a hierarchical model. On the top of the hierarchy is ideas or something that people want. And through hierarchy down to the actions or output, people are selling something, Rolls Royce, or I don't know what you were talking about. And they're expecting some feedback and how successful they are at selling. I hope this is what this is right, what I understood. And I wanted to ask you because Ashby, on the beginning of his book, Brain, or he asked himself, what is a design for a brain? Yeah, asked him, what does it mean to go things to better? So I would like to ask you, what do you think, or about what is your definition of better?
So firstly, Royce, thank you for your kind feedback.
You're really good.
No, you're welcome. Thank you. Yeah, so if I've understood the two questions correctly, so in terms of that earlier slide, where we're going from kind of very specific situations to my kind of theory of everything. And actually, if I use the example that Rory used, it's taking an idea from what seemed like a completely unrelated context, but it's actually applicable. So what I was trying to do with that early diagram is say, well, actually, there might be ways in which situations are very similar. I have a firefighter, they know how to deal with fires. But actually the particular situation may have more in common with something else. Now, I'm thinking about this in kind of generally in terms of corporate problem solving. So my example might be, I go up a layer of abstraction. So I'm not kind of in the theory of everything that actually I can't really apply to any such, apply specifically. I might go up a level and go, well, actually, I'm a manufacturer, but actually there's a marketing firm over there that solves a particular cost problem that is actually relevant because culturally, size of organization, there might be a number of other features that actually are very similar, which means that idea, I think, might actually work in the context I'm in. In terms of what is better, I think that goes back to that diagram of purpose. So I've got my whatever the entity is, I've got a feedback loop on it, but what is its purpose? And back to my haircutting example, yes, happy customer that feels they've had the right experience. That's success or better. And if I applied that actually in some of the debate about large versus small, what is better for a large consultancy is more money, bigger houses, more money in the bank for the senior management. I think for the smaller niche consultancies, there's a lot more there in terms of intellectual satisfaction and satisfaction at the impact they have on the clients.
I think that's a really important point. I think the issue of the impact on the client, the benefit the client is experiencing, I think is a really, really important one. Tanya, I'm just going to come to you in a second, but I wrote down, so as I was driving to Durham this morning from home, I found myself thinking about models again. With I had Jonathan's slides yesterday to have a sneak preview of what he was likely to show us. And I was reminded that I think it was Box that said all models are wrong. but some are useful. And Stafford said a model's neither true nor false, but more or less useful. And it made me think, of course, that what we are talking about when we talk about a theoretical model in consulting practice, everything that we work with in the world is a model. It's an abstraction from all the other stuff that's out there, and we isolate and identify bits of it that we choose to work with. The bits that impinge on our minds we hold in our heads, and that becomes our model, and our model in effect becomes our reality. So for the students of Plato, go and look at Utopia, the shadows on the back of the cave and all that stuff. So we have to remember that what we're working with is our abstraction, our interpretation, and whilst we may call it the whole, we have to recognize that it is partial, because it's our abstraction. So we have an interesting sort of convoluted, our whole is partial, so our partial also becomes the whole, because the whole model we're dealing with is the partial abstraction from the whole thing that actually exists. So we have different levels of intellectual abstraction going on. And in answer to your question, Louise Barker, the answer is Dr. Peter Dudley, whose first profession was as a hairdresser, and gave it up before he stabbed somebody in the eyes with his scissors, and went and did a master's in information systems and a PhD in cybernetics. So hairdressing is the root of all evil. Tanya, your hand is eventually up.
Yes, thanks, John. Just to kind of going back to what Rory said about expertise and specialization, I have a few points to make here. So number one, we as students, it seems, are, ushered into getting master degrees. I know a few of my own peers who are planning to get a master's degree straight after the bachelor's degree, which puzzles me, because surely if you are in the pursuit of expertise, you should perhaps try your hand at it in a commercial context first and see if it's something that fits your bill. But hey ho, that's a different story. So on the basis of what we've said, I suppose I have a few questions and a few comments to make. So my first comment would be, does that mean the new frontier of competition, the new frontier of adding value, is indeed lying at the intersection of disciplines? So going back to what Rory has said about having specialist knowledge, it seems that the notion here is somebody, he said later on, that somebody with a set of skills that are useful in limited specific situations. Though at the same time, surely we as professionals need to hold a multidisciplinary view. And this is, I guess, where cybernetics comes in. So perhaps it would be better to be a specialist in the sense if we consider the entire T-shaped consultants model, whereby you need the breadth and the depth in order to present an informed perspective. So on the basis of that, perhaps you do need the specialism, though at the same time, you either need an open-minded approach in order to have peripheral multidisciplinary pursuits or knowledge, and therefore you can rather create value at the intersections of different disciplines, because it seems the argument here right now is we have, let's say, an engineer, we have a design specialist, and then we have a business specialist. And these individuals can only operate in the very limited spheres of specialism. But the question is, who lies at the intersection? And more importantly, perhaps could these existing professionals be able to enrich the value they add in their insights through integrating multidisciplinary perspectives? So I suppose this kind of connects into what I mentioned in the chat earlier about Steve Jobs's theory of connecting the dots. And so in that sense, it seems one could argue that it is important to have some specialist knowledge, to have that depth, because if you are superficially connecting the dots, then in that case, your insights, although they might be creative and valuable, they may not be robust and resilient enough because you have not explored the intricacies that come with a pursuit of specialist knowledge. So I suppose the question I'd like to present here is, number one, what are your thoughts? And number two, what in that case is the best means of adding value? Would it be for existing professionals who have already chosen a specialist route to occasionally take in knowledge from different disciplines and keep it at a very peripheral level, or as was my degree sold to me, business analytics, telling us that we would be the intermediary, we would be the people at the intersection and therefore highly valuable. Would it be better to get a little bit of knowledge everywhere and not have a specialist route at all, and therefore only attacking the intersection in itself? So I hope that's not too rambly, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I'm sure that question was directed straight at Mr. Randall.
Yes. Fortunately, it was the same topic I was just going to come in about this whole thing of expertise versus non-expertise. I think there's a thing here about experience. So I might have a non-expert solve a problem really well, but it might be because of the experience they have, not necessarily directly in that field. Could be other characteristics. Imagination, not having experience could be helpful. So I think for me, this really comes back down to it depends. It depends on the circumstances. It depends on the type of problem I'm trying to solve. And I think to the question you're asking, Tanya, which route is the best route to go? It depends what you want. And it's a bit like the people I know who, my peers who kind of went on with KPMG and became partners and now earn lots of money. In their way, they're happy. I would have not been happy doing that. In the company I'm working in, Rolls, I can see people who have gone down a very specialized route, but that is right for them. They're very happy because that they absolutely know everything about their particular domain. Other people we've sent barking mad by that, and their career path is moving around and they're much more in the generalist model. And again, it depends, and you kind of need both types of individual, both types of experience, both types of approach. I think my answer probably isn't very helpful, but I think it depends, and I think you only learn that by trying stuff, by doing roles and really learning. And certainly over my career, there've been several insight points, but it's through trying stuff I really wanted to do and then realizing, no, that isn't actually me. I need to kind of course correct.
So there's no way to overcome the universal law of trial and error?
Well, we're learning machines. We are people are learning machines. By Louise, we learn and grow by exploring our world, tripping over and hurting ourselves, and then learning not to trip over and learning not to hurt ourselves. So we are error prone, and actually only by making error can we truly learn, is one of the sort of kind of arguments. I think there's something interesting. One of the, before I left the bank, I was working with a guy whose first name was Peter, can't remember his surname, and the bank had spent about 23 years training this guy to be a really, really good red hot corporate banker. He was brilliant at lending money to corporate, but actually he spent most of his day really, really badly managing a team of people, because they'd spent 23 years teaching him to lend money and 2 weeks teaching him how to manage people. But the bulk of his job was managing people. So he became not just a good specialist, but a really bad generalist, because the context in which he worked didn't enable him to develop that breadth that we're talking about. So, and I think if you, a generation ago, there was a notion of this thing called the polymath, and we refer to various people in society as perhaps being polymaths, who have that blend of sort of deep expertise in one or two areas and a general ability to absorb and understand the world. We don't value that because it isn't a functional expertise, and perhaps we ought to. Rory, I'll come back to you. Your hand's been up a while. We're running out of time as well, folks.
I will say though that literally everything about this discussion is clarified in this book range. So if you are at all interested by this, please read this book, because I don't want to just spout everything that's in it. But the one point that you said about, okay, should I be a specialist or should I be a generalist? Now, there was a study mentioned in this book. I think it was a study of people at 3M that were scientists. I think that the role was corporate scientists, and they were the people that were developing stuff, the people that developed sticky notes, the people that developed pioneering technology. And they grouped them into 3 categories. One category was the scientists that weren't particularly specialist at anything, and they didn't have as many patents, and they made the least progress in the company. The second type of scientists was the specialists. They didn't have much wide knowledge, but they did have one domain that they were specialist in and knew huge amounts about. They were second in terms of how much progress they made and how well they did at the company. The third category, now this is the main one that we all want to be, is the ones that were generalists and had a wide breadth of knowledge in lots of different domains, but had one specialist domain. So those were the ones that were the most successful. So in terms of career plan, find a domain that you really like and you really enjoy and get specialist at it, but don't let that take away from your ability to be wide and have breadth and be able to take from lots of different experiences. So I'll throw in another example for you, and because this actually links back to when you were saying, okay, is all the progress going to be made at the intersection? And pretty much, yes, that's exactly what's going to happen, because we're at a point now where we've discovered a huge amount. And with this example, James Dyson, his technology in his vacuum cleaners already existed. It's not something that he invented. What he actually did is he went to, I think it was some sort of construction refinery, and he saw how the chimneys worked, and he saw that technology and he thought, do you know what, I could use it in a vacuum cleaner. And that's exactly what he did. He didn't create anything new. He just adapted something that already existed and applied it to a completely different domain. And that's what you see. And there's probably several more examples in this book that you'd be able to find, but I can't think of off the top of my head. But ultimately, yes, that is true, is that finding there's a whole chapter called Lateral Thinking with Withered Technology, and it's all about applying things from one domain and taking it to another. And you'll find in this book that the intersection is where it's at. Find something that you're specialist in and love to death and get totally nerd out on it, but allow yourself to have the breadth so that you can apply things and find those intersections where they exist, because that is going to be the next era of scientific progress.
So one of the things we're going to have to wind up, but one of the things that follows from that is about 40 years ago, I was taught about analogical and metaphorical reasoning, about inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning and inference and all that stuff. And so it's great that there's current material on that that we can build on. So I'm guessing a lot of copies of Range are going to get sold tonight, Rory, so that'll be good. We have two exciting speakers next month, and if I could remember their names, I'd tell you who they are. So it's April, so we've got Gustav Borgerfolk. Gustav has just finished his PhD, I think I've pronounced that correctly, just finished his PhD. I think he's in, if I remember rightly, it's Denmark, but it might be Norway, one or the other. So we'll be looking at the work that he's done in his PhD, and we will be hearing from Russell B, the complete contrast. Russell is the lead consultant, we shouldn't talk about consultants again, should we, on asset management practice for IBM. He's their global technical lead on a product called Maximo and works in various industries doing interesting stuff with information. So those are our two speakers for next month. I'll get the advert formally out to you as soon as possible. So thanks again for coming, everybody. Look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks for your participation and questions, and we'll put the video up on YouTube as soon as we've got it processed. So thanks very much and see you soon. Good night.